There is a dangerous loophole that is putting people in the UK in serious danger, and the government needs to do something about it. And on this occasion, Uber Eats has been caught red-handed, as one of you guys, my viewers, has sent me a transcript of a chat that you had with Uber Eats, and they simply don't answer the question. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, the dangerous loophole is as follows. These delivery companies allow their account holders to substitute a driver for somebody else. There is a certain criteria that they say they must meet, but they allow them to substitute the driver for somebody else. And that means they probably cannot be certain as to who it is. And in response to a Freedom of Information request submitted by Thomson Reuters in 2023, this story here was reported last year, so this is not a new thing. They say the government's Interior Ministry then said that 42% of riders stopped by an enforcement team over a period of 6 days in April 2023 were found to be working illegally. The then illegal migration minister, Michael Tomlinson, said illegal working puts their customers at risk and drives down wages and defrauds the taxpayer. He said it is vital that we shut down any loophole that allows it to happen. And the companies involved committed to enhanced security checks. But this is still going on. Nothing has been shut down. No loophole has been closed. This is still happening because I have proof in front of me of exactly this from one of my viewers, which I'll come back to in a moment. So is this really a loophole, or is it a much simpler contractual position? Well, it's actually very simple. The companies, i.e. Deliveroo, Uber Eats, etc., they are allowed to contract with anybody however they like, providing it's within the law, which includes allowing them to substitute out somebody else. So people that work as substitute teachers or freelance lecturers and things like that, under the contracts, they are typically allowed to substitute somebody else in to teach that position for them. And one of the reasons is for tax implications and so on, but more about that in another video. But this is the freedom to contract. They are allowed to do so unless there is a law or a regulation that prevents them from doing so. So unless this is really clamped down, it simply will continue. What does frustrate me is when the government blocks the attempts by the companies to ask for information about which hotels these are being operated from, i.e. these illegal migrants are living in hotels paid for by the taxpayer, being fed, paid by the taxpayer, or paid money by the taxpayer, and then working for these companies by renting these accounts and not paying tax, obviously, because they're not allowed to be working, earning up to £1,000 a week, and all the while putting you at risk. Here's a conversation between one of my viewers and Uber Eats, who flat out refused to address the real concern, and instead just provided the straightforward bog standard answers that they provide to everybody else. Now, in the covering email, my viewer said that he'd been boycotting Uber Eats and other such apps as much as possible for the last month since this scandal broke. However, he's a qualified individual. However, during a particularly arduous 12-hour shift, it became apparent that Uber Eats would be the only means of getting food that day. He placed an order, and lo and behold, a different person in a different car with zero English language capability arrived. He reported this through the app and on X, as they've no email or phone number, and here ensues the following conversation, with the title, Delivery Person Didn't Match the Picture. Now, obviously I've blanked out certain information, including that of my viewer, but he writes to Uber Eats as follows. The person delivering the food was not this guy, and was not driving the vehicle I was expecting. There is, therefore, no way to be certain that he has the right to work in the UK, or appropriate insurance. Vehicle was a black Audi registration blah. He goes on, black Audi registration blah, not the person in the picture or the car expected. No means of checking they have the right to work in the UK or insurance for work. Uber Eats come back as follows. We are sorry to hear about this experience. We've escalated this to a specialised support team and they'll be reaching out as soon as possible. Thanks for letting us know that the delivery person and vehicle did not match the profile shown in your app. As delivery persons are independent contractors, delivery persons who use the Uber Eats app have the right to appoint a substitute to carry out deliveries on their behalf, providing they meet the same criteria as account holders. Uber Eats requires the account holders to register their substitutes so we can verify their identity and their legal right to work in the UK. If we find there's been a verification failure or an unregistered substitute or breach of our community guideline while delivering, we will investigate and take appropriate action. But it seems that they didn't in this case, which is quite alarming. If there were any further issues with your order or the delivery, let us know. Thank you for your feedback. That was it. So this was being reported to Uber Eats that it was not the person expected, and they just said, well, yes, we allow them to send somebody else, and those are the rules. So my viewer writes back and says, how can I be certain that you will check whether this substitute was authorised and has the right to work in the UK? How can you know that if they give you a name, that's the same person that I saw today? This is totally unacceptable loophole to allow potentially illegal migrant working. I will have to approach the press about this, my viewer writes, and send it to me. How can you assure me that the person delivering wasn't a victim of modern-day slavery if you don't know who he is? Uber Eats come back again. Thank you for your message. We are sorry to hear of any confusion this may have caused. Kindly note that delivery persons are able to appoint a substitute make deliveries on their behalf as long as they meet the following requirements. They're 18 years old, they've got the right to work in the country, they've not had their account deactivated, they have the relevant insurance where required, and they know how to perform deliveries safely in accordance with applicable road safety, food safety, and health and safety laws. Let us know if you have any further queries. So, bog standard normal rubbish. How do you verify, my viewer asks, who these substitutes are and that they meet the above requirements and are not illegally working or modern-day slavery victims? Do you know the name of the man who delivered my items? Because here's where I will jump in and say they really should, because if they are substituting somebody else who will have your address and where you are, where you live, etc., there really should be some kind of audit trail here. I think there is a potential liability on the company's part for allowing someone to come to your home, have all of that data, and not necessarily track who they are. What if a crime happens, as it has done in recent stories? There have been horrendous stories where men have turned up to deliver something and sexually assaulted a girl in her own home. They absolutely should, in my view, keep a detailed log of exactly who it is that's delivering these things. But anyway, my viewer goes on. Sorry, I asked the question above and no one gave me an answer. How do you confirm the substitute is who they say they are and has the right to work in the UK, has insurance, isn't being exploited? To whom should I address a freedom of information request to obtain such information? That really ought to be a subject access request rather than freedom of information. But to determine whether I and my friends or family should continue to use Uber Eats or Uber One subscriptions. And here comes a reply. Thank you for your message. We're sorry for any confusion. Kindly note that the delivery persons are able to appoint a substitute, etc. They're at least 18, right to work in the UK. Same response as before. Let us know if there's any further queries. No response needed. Bam. And they just close off the conversation. Then my viewer writes, you've said this 3 times now. How do you ensure all the above are met? How do you know the substitute they use is who they say? This is an essential legal requirement for preventing illegal working and modern-day slavery. I'll come back to that in a minute. Please answer the question I've asked. Do not just repeat your previous answers. Almost a day later, he writes again. I have still not received the information I've requested. Do you know who delivered my food? If so, how can you confirm the substitute is who you believe him to be? If not, how do you assure they have the legal right to work in the UK, license, insurance, and are not a victim of modern-day slavery? Please furnish me with this information as you have a statutory legal obligation to meet the criteria above. Now, I would say that they should be collecting sufficient data on who is delivering the order, because they are passing that data, the address of my viewer, to the account, and they in turn are using a substitute to deliver the food. It should not be much of a step to be able to provide that information to my viewer, because they should know who delivered it. So, in my view, they should be able to provide that information, and if not, then they are at some kind of risk here. And here's the conversation on X, essentially asking the same thing, spelling out that 3 times he's had no success asking the same question about substitute delivery drivers, and really should be able to be told who it was that delivered the food. And I would agree, at the very least, these companies should be able to tell you who delivered the food if it's delivered by a substitute. And that way, they should be able to work it back with Face ID or something else. It's all built into our phone these days. This should be possible. But as to whether it's a loophole, it could well be that this is a loophole that needs slamming shut pronto, because these companies would otherwise be liable for probably several £billion in fines. Because on the one hand, employers can be sent to prison for 5 years and pay an unlimited fine if they're found guilty of employing someone who knew or had reasonable cause to believe they didn't have the right to work in the UK. And that includes anyone that they didn't have permission to enter the UK, or their leave's expired, or they're not allowed to do certain types of work, etc. And on a civil basis, aside from the criminal aspect, they could be made to pay a civil penalty of £60,000 per illegal worker. But these companies doubtless are relying on this sort of a loophole whereby they have the freedom to contract with these people that own the accounts, and they are then substituting other people in. And the companies say so long as they abide by the rules, they can substitute somebody else in. Now, you'll probably at least have heard that Uber ended up at the Supreme Court, which in short started as an employment tribunal where some drivers said they should be treated as workers, which is a relationship akin to employment, but they're not employed, but they are entitled to certain basic things, such as minimum pay, holiday pay, pension, and so on. And Uber lost that argument, and essentially, although they initially tried to say that this only applied to those workers, then very quickly changed the position and said that now all drivers were recategorized as workers. And this is made clear on their website. A worker is an employment classification that is unique under UK employment law. They're not employees, but entitled to national living wage, holiday pay, etc. However, they have also always maintained that this does not apply to the Uber Eats platform. Under this question here, does this apply to couriers using the Uber Eats platform? They say no. This does not apply to couriers who use the Uber Eats platform. And their position for this, as I understand it, is that the Uber Eats platform is sufficiently different to Uber in that it is not a passenger getting into a car with a driver. Rather, it is somebody delivering something to you at your home address or wherever. Therefore, they remain self-employed, a contractor. Therefore, they can substitute somebody else out to do the delivery. Now, if I were to hazard a guess as to what would happen if this went to the Supreme Court again, I would probably suggest that that relationship is probably sufficiently akin to employment to trigger the same response and the same ruling as it was applied to the drivers. Now, that would be for the court to determine, but if that's the case, then it would rule everybody a worker for the same purposes and would probably have consequences as to whether or not they can substitute out a rider or courier to someone else to deliver your goods or food or whatever, and that would obviously have massive consequences. So is this a bit of a loophole? I think it is a bit of a loophole being relied upon by Uber Eats, Deliveroo, whoever else, that they are using this somewhat narrow interpretation, sidestepping the Supreme Court ruling as it applies to drivers and saying that couriers, delivery drivers, are different. And therefore, I think it needs addressing. If you've had experiences like this, do send them to me. I will make them public. And we really do need to stamp out this illegal working because it is having an impact on wages, on tax, and everything else around the country. Because all of these have a knock-on effect. And so I, for one, said in a recent video that I was going to order a takeaway just a few nights ago. I didn't, as it happens, because all of the restaurants locally used one of these services. And I refuse to use one of these services while this scandal is going on. So let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.